like the suicide problems, the alcohol and drug addiction. Like, it's like if you think of a tree, so those are kind of all the branches of the problems, but there's a real core, or like the root of the problem. So lots of times we're addressing all these branch symptoms instead of the actual real problem, which is like a loss of culture and knowledge. So to me, burning comes into that. And I know people think like, oh, it's just like burning a forest, like, or, burning the understory. It's not a big thing, but it's getting people out on land. It's telling them how much their ancestors knew about forest, how well they managed the forest, how they were able to live in like very difficult conditions through that knowledge base that they had. And then, having them practice it and try and bring it back and be valued.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Kristoff. On this podcast, we talk about environmental sciences with the goal of healthy forest and sustainability for all values. On this podcast today, we're talking about fire, but not the way you're thinking of it. Right now, wildfires are running rampant across Alberta. A bunch of communities are currently evacuated or on evacuation notice. So this is wildfire is a very real issue in this province and in other provinces as well. As I speak today, northern Alberta is completely covered in a shroud of wildfire smoke from the fires happening in High Level and near Wabasca. And the whole province has this orange glow from the sun being filtered through that smoke. So everybody in the province is aware of it. And there was days where you can't even go outside because you just start coughing from the smoke. It's very, very thick, depending on where you are in the province, of course. So that's wildfire. And obviously creates a lot of fear and a lot of emotions in a lot of people. Today's episode is not about wildfire. Today's episode is, as you can tell by the title, called Good Fire. So Good Fire is a bit of it's an interesting teaser into this, but I wanted to talk about cultural burning, so Indigenous burning. So pre-colonialization, Indigenous people, First Nations people used to burn for a number of reasons. You could call it a controlled burn because they were in control of as many factors as they could possibly be in control of, and they would burn for very specific reasons. They would burn for creating moose habitat, or for creating, depending on where you are, for berry production, or for a specific medicinal plant, or for any number of things, right? So they were very in tune with, what the forest needed as far as creating biodiversity and that kind of stuff. And, since settlers have been here, they have been kicked out of those areas and unable to do cultural burning, which not only has an environmental impact, but also has a huge cultural impact on those communities, and it lessens their community health in a huge, huge way. And I brought on Amy Cardinal Christianson. She is a research scientist with the federal government, and she studies, she's a wildfire scientist, but she focuses very specifically on Indigenous burning and what Indigenous burning was, how we can start to get it back on the landscape, why it's important, why people that are non-Indigenous people should care about it. And we've actually done a podcast series together called Good Fire, which is going to be out in September of 2019. And that is going to do a full deep dive into the very specific problems and issues, the history and the future of Indigenous burning, and how we can start to incorporate that back on our landscape in order to have healthy forests for all values. So yeah, that podcast is going to do a deep dive. It's going to do a lot of different things, the cultural side, the political side, the philosophical side. You guys should really check it out. I'll make sure to remind you come September, because obviously it's a little early, but yeah, she's an awesome woman. She has a lot of great insight, and this is a really good conversation. If you guys want to learn about Indigenous culture, as well as healthy forests, including more values into what we consider sustainable forest management, because right now I think we're always expanding that idea of sustainable forest management to include more and more in order to achieve this goal of sustainable forests, in perpetuity forever. And we're still heading in that direction. So talking about Indigenous burning is a big part of that, and it needs to start happening again, I think. And Amy's the perfect person to talk about it. She can speak from both perspectives. I mean, she's an academic as well as an Indigenous person, and she's dedicated her life to this. So she has a really good perspective from both sides. You can see the gap, the information gap that exists there. So you guys are really going to like this episode. Trust me. It's great. Sponsors for this episode, Greenlink Forestry, the original sponsor, and I couldn't thank them enough for their support. Thank you very much. And they're doing good work in the forestry sector. And also Damage Timber. Damage Timber is a apparel company out of Edmonton, Alberta, and they are supporting environmental sciences through the sale of their clothing. You can go to damagetimber.com and pick their clothing up. 10% of everything they sell goes towards a scholarship for people going into environmental sciences, which is really cool. They're certified 2% sustainable and all this kind of stuff. It's really interesting. So definitely check them out. Damagetimber.com, your Forest 10 at checkout, and you get 10% off. So yeah, cool. And then the most important one for this year, for 2019, is West Fraser. West Fraser is a forestry company in Western Canada, and they're doing great work making sure that we continue to push the boundary of what we call sustainable forest management. So thanks very much for making this podcast possible. I appreciate the support. And without any further mess around, let's get into it. It's Amy and I talking about Indigenous burning. Here we go. Talking about like this show that we've been working on, it's definitely opened up my eyes to the complexities that is cultural burning, right, and Indigenous burning. Yeah. So how would you explain Indigenous burning to somebody? Like if you come across somebody at a cocktail party or whatever, how do you explain that to them?
Yeah, like what my job is,
kind
of. Yeah. So I guess I would say that Indigenous people have been stewarding on the land for a long time. So there's basically we needed to be able to live off the land and off the resources, mm-hmm. right? So I think our ancestors saw that by using fire in certain ways, it would encourage certain things. So different types of plant growth or mm-hmm. attract animals to the area or, decrease fire risk, right? So it's kind of like a method of science whereby repetition and seeing fire on the landscape, they found that it was actually could be used as a tool mm-hmm. for how to live. And right. So I think, that's kind of where Indigenous burning has come from. Right. Obviously, it was stopped when settlers first came because they were trying to protect timber and protect watersheds, and they thought that excluding fire was the way to do that. Mm-hmm. Obviously hasn't worked that great. So so moving forward, I think Indigenous people have always been involved in fire in the background, but hopefully, get back burning again.
Yeah, for sure. Because so cultural burning is something that was happening for a long time, for mm-hmm. for thousands of years or whatever, however long that First Nations people have been here. Yep. And it was part of the ecosystem, right? Like it was mm-hmm. it was happening all the time, keeping the land healthy and this kind of stuff, right? Yeah. So how do you go about explaining that to somebody who's never had any experience with fire? Like all they see is wildfire, right? Yeah. And they see just the catastrophe that is a wildfire going through a town or something like that. Yeah. How do you come across people that are mm-hmm. they don't understand the important health benefits, the ecosystem health benefits of fire? Yeah,
even in our Indigenous communities, lots of people are now worried about fire and scared of fire. Yeah. And I think, so for me, when I come across people that kind of have that tendency to think of fire as bad, I always say, well, there's good fire. And that's kind of, the name from the podcast. So, when we're doing these kind of good fires, it's not a wildfire. It's totally different. Mm-hmm. So I think lots of people see prescribed burning that agencies do, where, they're kind of some of them, they're starting crown fires. Yeah. And so they see that and equate it with what we want to do. But we're doing very low risk burning at very off season times where, a chance of having an escape fire or a crown fire is very low. So early spring, late fall. Mm-hmm. So I think the easiest way that I would say to people, if they were, scared or worried about it, I usually just say that, there's good fire too that happens. And, the boreal forest especially is a fire dependent ecosystem. It needs fire to survive. Mm-hmm. And there's Indigenous people know that there's ways to do that from, our years of, a long time of being here, since time immemorial, we say. So that means further back than memory or stories can tell us.
Mm-hmm. Than recorded history, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, and even our ancestors, because, some bands have have stories, that go back 6,000 years that they can remember and recall in their oral histories. So even further than that.
It's a long game of telephone.
Yeah, totally. But the cool thing is, like the one with the Wangitskin band, they had an oral history of a landslide. So in their oral history, it was a bear roaring into this valley and kind of like devouring the community, right? And so when people hear that, they're like, oh, a big bear came in. But then they actually found through geologic records and stuff that there was 6,000 years ago a huge landslide that occurred into this valley.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So yeah, that's the neat thing about science and Indigenous knowledge now that's happening is, kind of combining these stories. Yeah. And I mean, for Indigenous people, it's great because it provides kind of proof around land claims.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
Territory. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I guess I want to start with explaining so this is something that it sounds like it was something that was like integrated into like the culture in a sense it wasn't just like a prescribed burn. Like we think today, people hear about prescribed burns and they're on board with prescribed burns, right? Like, okay, yes, we need to keep the forest healthy by burning it because we've been suppressing burns for so long. So we need to start reintroducing it, right? Yep. So how does cultural burning differ in your in your own words from the cultural burning aspect, right? I think that's where people start to break down a little bit, right? Because they can get on board with the environmental like health, ecosystem health and stuff like that. But I think we should explain maybe like more the cultural aspect of it and the important to Indigenous health and that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah. So when you think of like a forest structure, you obviously have your big trees, your old trees in the forest, then you have like your new ones coming up and then your understory of plants, right? I mean, that's a very simplistic way of putting it.
It works.
But so for prescribed burning, generally what happens is, sometimes, they ignite it by helicopter or other things, but it generally takes everything, right? Like even sometimes the older, bigger trees, because they're basically introducing sometimes, I should say, high intensity fires. Sometimes they're not, but they're generally trying to start high intensity fires to reduce wildfire risk, right? And for ecological benefits too. But lots of them, it's generally starting these big crown fires that kind of, take everything and almost mimic a wildfire. So for an Indigenous burning and what we do, it's usually low intensity burns and they're all in the understory. So what we're trying to do is like leave the big trees. So to kind of protect the canopy and then remove any like older or diseased trees. And basically restore what's in the understory. So, lots of times now we're seeing like that high fuel load of like, litter or, even like medicinal plants or berries that are just overgrown and really not producing.
Yeah.
So for our culture, like the one person was saying to me, like, that we burn to live because, if those berries aren't producing or if there's not medicinal plants that we can use as medicines or if there's not moose or deer coming to the area, we die, right? Like it's that blank, like, back historically. So I think that what they found through kind of doing these understory burns is that they actually promote these berries and things. So they're generally you don't want to burn the top of the soil. You want to preserve the plant roots, but kind of take and remove all that dead litter that's on the top. And so a byproduct of that is that you remove fuel load.
Right.
From the forest. But the hard thing with it is that it takes time. So agencies, I think, it's a lot easier just to go and light a big fire because our burns are slow most of the time. And I want to say that too, because some nations do high intensity fires for different reasons. But generally, we're doing these kind of low, very early spring burns that, you can be on for days and only burn a few hectares, right? Because you're making sure it doesn't get too hot, but you want it hot enough. So it really involves a lot of caretaking or stewarding. So I think like that's kind of the one downfall of the burning we do in terms of, managing the fire risk in Canada.
Right.
But on a positive way, that it tends to then leave the, the big trees and kind of create more of a park-like thing that people like, right? Because it's easy to get around and it attracts birds and moose and other things to the area.
Yeah, it's different than the just kind of, thick kind of can't walk through it. Yeah.
Well, like northern Saskatchewan, I went there for some field work on an evacuation study actually. And like, I could not believe the black spruce. I was just like, how do moose live here because it was just so close together and so dense. Like there's no way a big moose can get through that area, right? Or any of, so yeah. So I think that in that way, like what we're doing is kind of opening up those areas.
Okay. Yeah. So do you have, can you speak to kind of the change from the environmental perspective, and I think we'll get back into the cultural side of it and get more in depth into that in a little bit.
Yep.
But from just to try to set the stage of the environmental impact that it's had going from or not even centuries, but like thousands of years of cultural burning, indigenous burning on the landscape, to all of a sudden none of it, like whatever it was, like the 1900s or something like that, it was all, I think it was all stopped, right? Like it was, you can explain it better than I can, but can you explain what happened to the forest when we went from that system to the current, like to where we're currently at, you know, to totally not allowing it, and then why we need to start bringing it back in?
Sure.
It's a big question, but like just to set the stage, right? And then
well, and I don't want to make, you know, like early settlers either seem to be the bad guys, you know, like I think when they came here and were, you know, moving across Canada and obviously doing some bad things, but in terms of fire, you know, I think that they just saw it as a big hazard, right? And so it would, you know, take trees, right? And they needed those trees, and it would, you know, kind of make a bunch of the water not nice, right? And they need water to survive. And, you know, on the prairies, you know, they would get these roaring grass fires coming across the prairie, right? So you can see that it was scary for people and why people would want to ban it. But I think what they didn't realize, you know, was that we need fire in Canada, especially in other places around the world. So the earliest fire suppression campaign in Canada was actually in 1610 in Newfoundland.
1610?
Yeah, so that was when they first start saying no Indian should set fire to the forest.
Huh.
But interestingly enough, there were surveyors that were going across Canada, you know, kind of at the front of all the settlers, and they were saying like that, you know, a white person basically dropping a cigar stub in the prairie is much more dangerous than an Indian fire.
Right.
So I think that some people recognize, you know, that the type of burning that we were doing was beneficial, but there was so much
purposeful. It wasn't an accident. It was, exactly.
Yeah, but there was so much like fear. And then I think, you know, there was that real, European feeling of supremacy of knowledge, right? Like that what they were doing and how they managed things was proper. Whereas in Canada, you know, when they came, so they saw our knowledge as being inferior to theirs. Whereas like, instead of looking at it as, you know, like we've survived here for thousands of years, like maybe listen to what we're trying to tell you.
Yeah. The Pocahontas situation, right? Savages or whatever was a real thing, right? It was,
Yeah. And they probably just, I don't know what they thought we were doing with fire, but obviously that it was something scary.
Well,
and
they probably just saw you as godless savages or whatever, right? Like a different culture, and it's not seen as legitimate. It's seen as, well, we're going to bring Christianity and you know what I mean, good industry to this place. And it's, I don't know, who knows what they were thinking, but
well, and when we look at ecosystems, right, like in Europe, it's very different. And I mean, even in England and, you know, places that settlers originally came from in France and stuff, like it's so different there because the population is so much more dense.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, in Canada, it's different. We have like forest that's fire dependent. So, and I think when they came too, they just saw our forest as being so beautiful and like, you know, park, like they always say, like, you know, you could easily navigate through the forest, but we would say, you know, well, that's probably because of wildfire for one, and also Indigenous burning that we were doing on the landscape. And so this too, I don't want to say, you know, that, or people listening to this to think that, you know, Indigenous people were burning every square foot of Canada and managing it, right? Like we managed our territories and around like our communities, and some nations used burning a lot more than others. So but across Canada, what we see is that, you know, from the Micmac to, you know, the coastal Salish, people used fire in Canada for basically so they could live on the land.
I don't imagine you can like estimate this, but what do you think the estimated population was of Indigenous people from like, say, just like pre-colonialization?
Yeah.
Do you have any kind of rough idea?
I thought there was actually just a study that came out on that. Did you see that? Because it was talking about how there was like actually a change in the world's climate because of the genocide of Indigenous.
Oh, I did see that.
But they had numbers in there but I can't remember how much it was, but I know that like, you know, we dropped from a lot of people living.
It was like 90% of the population died from like diseases and stuff that were just like unintentionally just came with. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
came with the settlers,
the
right?
smallpox
Yeah.
was a big one. So that was when, and so this is kind of leads to like the distrust that a lot of Indigenous people have of non-Indigenous people in Canada is like when settlers first came over, they would go to the Indigenous communities and give them presents of blankets. And what the Indigenous people didn't realize was that those were blankets that were, used for smallpox, people that were suffering or had died of smallpox. And when they died, they would like give their blankets to the Indigenous population.
Do we know that was because I read something that was saying that it wasn't intentionally that they spread the smallpox, but it happened anyways.
Well, I think it was probably, well, I think back then they didn't really know that much about transmission of disease.
So probably wasn't intentional. It was just like, they didn't get that germs. Yeah. They just had blankets come available. Yeah. They happened to be from there. And they're like, oh, we'll give them to the, yeah, exactly. Okay.
But then I think, maybe if some people, like there was lots of written things even in the federal government, right, with like John A. Macdonald and other people who, saw that things like that were working to, get rid of Indigenous people. So, so it's not like they tried to stop the practice or like there was a big health intervention or anything.
Well, there was a lot of racism back then. It was not, we weren't exactly a, what do you call it? A recognized society, right? We definitely didn't recognize that racism was a problem and all this kind of stuff. But anyways, like getting into so I guess we should bring this back to burning at some point, but it's
it's all relates. It's all related for us. Yeah,
totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so
like I think in the communities that I go to now and I speak with, they and because most Indigenous people want to bring back burning, right, and bring back that cultural practice to their landscape because. Most elders, when they look at the forest, the first thing that they say is that it's unhealthy and that it needs cleaning up. And so when I first started working a bunch of elders, I'd always hear this cleaning up phrase, cleaning up. And, it took a while till I realized that, that meant fire, that they wanted. Because, don't normally think of that. Yeah. You think like, oh, go out with a rake or something like Donald Trump thinks that we're doing. But, it was actually, that they wanted to use fire to kind of clean up all that dead litter on the forest floor. So most of them talk about like, that they just want to do that again in their territory. But I think they also realize that because of the fire suppression that we've had over the last, 50 to 300 years, depending where you are in Canada, that it's not that easy just to bring back our burning practices, right? Because we burned on intervals. So depending on where you were, or, if you were burning a meadow, you might burn the meadow every 3 years. If you were burning like, an old growth forest stand, you might burn every 20 years. Like, it just depended on what you were burning or what objective you were trying to achieve. So, now we've excluded fire. So, I mean, the litter and the buildup of fuel is crazy. So I think like now, most of the elders I talk to, they say like, if we went and tried to do this now, like we would basically burn down the forest because we'd be trying to start a low intensity burn, but there's just too much fuel on the floor. So it would immediately like escalate. So,
and that falls in line with with Western scientific knowledge as well, right? It seems like we've gotten to a place now where there's just, it's hard. We've been suppressing fire for so long that it's hard to start to re-engage with fire because you're right, the fuel buildup is unlike it's ever been before. So that has to have a huge impact on the environmental integrity and like habitat availability and biodiversity relative to pre-colonialization, right, and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's kind of what one point I wanted to hit home was the difference between what quote unquote natural, and I would consider when the Indigenous people were the only people here, that was part of the natural system. It was sustainable and it was, you know what I mean?
Well, I think the difference is like one difference between the Western and the Euro perspective and our perspective is that we're part of nature. So like you said, like we believe that like the stewarding that we do is part of that natural cycle of the forest because that's why we were put here to, help promote that or, help to, basically to help Mother Earth. Right. Yeah. And so I think whereas like Europeans see themselves almost as separate or distinct from the forest or from nature. Yeah,
absolutely. Our entire society today, we still see ourselves as leave nature alone, leave like all this. Right. It's like, no, we are of nature.
Yeah.
Like we are like this is very galactical, but it's like
I like that word, galactical.
I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson or somebody said something along the lines of, he's like, we are one way in which the universe knows itself.
Yeah. Okay.
So to separate ourselves from nature is inherently flawed, because we are of nature. We came from it. We are still of it.
Yeah.
And everything we do is natural in a quote unquote weird sense. But another way similar along those lines, and I think I told you this quote a second ago before we started recording, and it was, what was the name of that?
Nahewin or Nahiwin. Yeah.
Nahiwin, yeah. Those siblings.
Yeah.
They
the Cardinals.
The Cardinals. They had mentioned a quote from an elder, Indigenous elder, who said, "We are not stewarding the earth. We are the earth stewarding herself." And it's kind of along those same lines, right? But it's interesting that, somehow as like this Western culture, we see ourselves as separate from it, somehow, and better than it, and we need to manage it. And it's like, well, we do need to, like, it's different now because there's so many people and all that kind of stuff. But try and get back to that connection with nature is definitely, and especially for like your culture, right? It's ingrained, it's part of it. So trying to get back to that and to,
even for us, it comes to our language, right? Like our words for trees and grass and things, it's an animate being to us. It's not something, that's just there. To us, it lives, it breathes, it has a heartbeat. And I think to some of the, current studies that are going, because I know people hear that and they're like, oh my goodness, like this girl's crazy. But, coming from a scientific perspective, and I was raised, like I did my undergrad in geology, and, I can see that perspective too.
Well, you have your PhD, do you not?
Yeah. But,
so like you're in the scientific community, like this is not like unbeknownst to you, right? So
so like but I think like, so we always would say like, that trees have a heartbeat, right? But I think now they were just doing some different studies where they took kind of like, video of the forest canopy, and they could actually see that, depending on where the sun is and other things, that the trees actually kind of almost look like they're pulsing with like the leaves and how the branches move and things. And for me, I think like, if someone was sitting there hunting, and sitting in one place for a long time and just watching the forest around them, they could get that perception too, right? And so we have like, even on my property, I have what I call grandmother trees. So these are trees that, have been around, and like, they're probably like, 100, 150 years old. But, to me, they know the landscape. They know what's happened there. They're holders of knowledge, right? And so when you look at tree rings, people study tree rings and look at the stories that trees tell.
Dendrochronology. It's an entire field of study. Yeah.
Exactly. But to me, that's that the tree's alive and it's trying to tell it, and that's one way that the story of what happened to the tree can come out. And so I think that that's one thing where we see ourselves as different. So like when I go out with elders to burn or people on the landscape, like they will look at the forest and see that it's unhealthy, and then they feel bad themselves. Like I know for me, when I go and I see something like that, like I feel like some people I hear saying like, oh, I forest bath or this or that. Like that new thing where like, you go spend time in nature.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like when I go and I'm in an unhealthy forest, no matter if I'm forest bathing or whatever, to me, it's not. And I feel that like you can feel from like, you just get like a sense, that things aren't well. And I think that that's something that we're missing, is almost that emotions. So when people are, foresters go to the forest, they see, and I think it's from our training, right? You see like, the silviculture aspects and, tree heights and diameter and, what's growing and
ecology,
where the pine beetle, or like, if there's beetle kill or whatever, instead of,
productivity of the soil and the microbes in there. And but it's very scientific for sure.
And to us, it's all connected, right? So, and I think most people now know that, if you don't have healthy soil, if you don't have water, then you don't have trees and grass. And if you don't have that, you don't have animals. And, if you don't have animals and berries and water, you don't have us. So
it's all connected, like, of course, right?
Yeah. And I think that that's, one thing that Indigenous people, really can, like our knowledge can contribute a lot is to, understanding that and understanding the links, kind of like the web of life.
Yeah.
But not like, I don't want people to think of it in like a, hippy dippy way.
Yeah.
Because some people are just, look at you and just say, but we were at a conference and like a fire conference, and it was the Fire Continuum conference in Missoula, Montana. I think I told you this story, but all the talks were just very like, here's us modeling fire. Here's us,
Yeah.
doing this. But it was very like, this is my job. This is what, I do. These are the models I run. And so I was there with my Australian colleague, Trent, it will be featured in our Good Fire podcast. And him and I were both just kind of had a hard time at the conference because we didn't seem to fit.
Yeah.
And we ended up doing a presentation together. And in our presentation, it was just about like the lack of emotion.
Yeah.
Like, so for us, when we talk about fire, it's connected to us. Like, we feel it. And like, one thing is I shouldn't brag, but like, or like say, because I sound crazy, but like I always try to make, when I tell stories, like people cry when I talk about fire and things. And, it's not like I want people to cry, but it's just because I think that they feel like this different perspective to burning. So like one elder I was talking to from Hoyson, which is Bridge River First Nation in BC, we were talking about burning, and like his family hadn't been allowed to do it. So he remembers going out with his dad, and he's now in his 80s, right?
Yeah.
And he said like when his dad died, they weren't allowed to burn. And he said that his dad was devastated by not being able to burn, because people don't realize like what a big deal it is to us and to our culture. So when we went there, we were doing this revitalizing cultural burning thing. And like he started crying to me and saying like, I want to go back on the land and burn like my daddy used to.
Yeah.
And he's like, then I can die happy because my dad will know that, I helped to bring our responsibility back to the land base. And I think people, when they see that, they're like, lots of people get into fire for like the adrenaline and the, the excitement of getting a call and going out to the fire and, or watching it burn towards a community. But for us, it's more of like a quiet relationship, I think. And just having that, like, just being in the forest, you know? Yeah.
It's not, you're right. It's not like what we see as like, oh, it's this cool thing that I do. It's like, no, this is part of my everyday. Like, like we wake up and eat breakfast and we go to our job and we come home. It's like Indigenous people, it seems like, historically, you everything you did was related to breakfast and was related to nature and was related to I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this, but it's all interconnected, right? In a very concrete way, right? Like if you don't take care of the forest properly, you're not eating breakfast because it's not there, right? So, and it's interesting explaining that culture and that cultural aspect of fire, right? Because I don't think Western society, we don't think about it in that way, and it's because we don't have that deep connection. Like, I mean, everyone, I say that I dedicated my life to nature and making sure that it's sustainable, but it's not the same as I still, you know what I mean? I go home and watch Netflix and
we do too. Don't worry.
I know, but it's not, I guess. And like, well, and a lot of your life is everyone's life is westernized to some extent now. It's like you can't get away from it at this point. But I think the point you're trying to make, it's kind of like trying to get as much of a traditional Indigenous culture back into the communities so that they can be revitalized and healthy and feel part of the landscape again, right?
Yeah, well, we call it like two-eyed seeing. So that's kind of the new concept that's come up. So that's like, where as Indigenous people or even as non-Indigenous, like, you're looking at the world through one eye, through your Western perspective, right? Because we're all trained in that, like it's inevitable. There's very few people that, are born and raised in the bush and have that kind of only subsistence lifestyle.
Yeah.
So, but then out of the other eye, you can see with your Indigenous eye, right? So you can see, how, where things could be better. And I think for me, that's where fire management comes in because, I'm trained from the Western perspective, but I think, from like culture that like, there's things that Indigenous people do or know better. And, for me, part of my job is, advocating for that and trying. So, it's not saying like drop all Western science around fire, right? We need that.
Yeah.
We need that too. But then Indigenous people and our cultures also know ways, for making the forest healthy. So to me, if you bring those two together, it makes like, you know what I mean? It's then you have like an incredible knowledge base that you're coming from.
Right.
Yeah. So I think like one example is like talking to firefighters. So there's this one guy who was a non-Indigenous firefighter. So it's kind of funny up on the, the fire crews there. Lots of there's like 30 or 40 year Indigenous firefighters that have been on the fire line a long time. And they say, these new kids, like university grads, come up and start telling them what to do. So this one guy was actually telling me that he started out of university as kind of a fire boss and went up on the one line, and he had these native crews, and he said he thought they were the laziest people in the world, because he's like, they would get up in the morning and work a little bit, but then he's like, then they nap all day, and then like in the bush,
Yeah.
And then he's like, but then they would get up and kind of work all night, and then he's like, and then I started like really looking and watching what they were doing. And he said that then one of the guys came up and told him, like, we fight the fire when it's the weakest, because we see fire as a living being. And why would you fight something at the height of its day, like at 2 p.m. on a really sunny, hot day with high winds, right?
Yeah.
Like, why would you do anything, right? Like, the fire can just jump, or, but if you, fight it in the morning when it's the weakest, or in the evening or overnight,
when humidity is high and the temperature is low, and so the activity is
decrease. And I should say generally, now with climate change, who knows, but generally fire activity decreases at night, right? So anyways, but these guys have got that not from textbooks, but from years of being out and watching fires. So I think, and so he was saying, like, to me, like this non-Indigenous kid, that it was just amazing to see that, because he didn't learn any of that in school. And so for him, he said he learned more that summer working with the native crews about fire than, going to school, basically.
Oh, yeah.
And not to say, don't stay in school, kids, but like, because that's important too. But, there's other ways and other things to learn as well about fire.
For sure.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough that when I did fire, my my crew leader, Sheldon Houle, an Indigenous guy who's been fighting fire in like as a Helitack member, so in the very Western way for, I think when I was there, I think it was 10 or 15 years he'd been doing it. Yeah. But I remember from the very get-go, he would tell me and the rest of our crew, he'd be like, if you guys ever get a chance to fight fire with an Indigenous crew, like pay attention, like watch, like don't judge, just pay attention, because they know shit that you're never going to learn. Because like and it's true. I remember noticing that like the similar things, right? Like they totally did things differently, 100%. And there was a lot of judgment there, right? But from when Sheldon came in and gave us that perspective and told us like, just like talk to them, like trust me, they know way more than you do. And like, just be confident that that's the truth, right? And with time, you kind of build trust, and you can talk to some of these people and like learn the way they do things. And it's like they're not doing firefighting for a summer job. They're doing it because that's their way of like living in the summertime, right? And they've been doing this their entire life. So it's like, it's for me as a university student, exactly. It was just like this cool adrenaline rush. Like it was lots of fun. I liked it. It was cool. But for them, it was a totally different thing. And it's, it was interesting to get that perspective. I think I was lucky that way, but. Yeah,
lots of the Indigenous fire guys, they always tell me one of the funniest things is like when the fire season first starts, and like in Cree, the word for white boy or whatever is moonial. So they say like, oh, it's so funny when like the moonial come on the fire, because he's like, they're all just doing selfies with the fire in the background. And he's like, and we're all like, actually working. And he's like, and you look, and all the moonial are just lined up way away from the fire taking selfies. And then it was funny, because then I started seeing on Facebook like lots of people.
Oh yeah, they do well on Instagram.
But I think that's like just maybe a bit of, and it's like kind of more of like, because for Indigenous people, it's more of a lifestyle, right? So they've been doing that. So it's a great career for Indigenous people, because they can go out in the summer, make money, be on the land, and then in the winter they can go and like run their trap lines or hunt, be with their families, and like kind of participate in their culture. So I think that's why it's become like kind of a nice lifestyle for, sure. For certain people.
Yeah, for sure. So there was something you said a little while ago, and it's been on my mind. I wrote it down. It was like the healthy forest.
Oh yeah.
Right. And could we maybe explain that a little bit? And because I think that depends on perspective, right? Like it depends on what the definition of healthy forest is, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like from an academic perspective, but also from an Indigenous perspective, because luckily you have both perspectives, which is pretty convenient.
Some days.
So what do you mean by healthy forest? Because I think some people could say there's arguments that like we have too much old growth, or we don't have enough old growth, or we have too much shrub, or not enough grazing land, or too much. So like, how, in your definition, do you define healthy forest? Because I think that's something that like some of the forest professionals listening might have, might want clarification on as well.
Yeah. So I think for us, because we see it different, like not as an economic thing, you know, but so for me, like, you know, so to someone, a healthy forest might be like, you know, lots of like nice Douglas fir or something that, you know, they can make a lot of money off of or something, you know, they're growing healthy, but it's kind of a monoculture, right? For us, a healthy forest would be a forest that we can live off of. So like the one Pierre Kruger, who's a fire keeper in Penticton Indian Band, he often talks about how like when you look out at the forest as an Indigenous person, you see it almost as an orchard and a garden. So you know, it's what's there naturally and what's growing. So instead of, you know, going and planting a garden or growing apple trees or something, you know, like you already kind of have that around you. So for every nation, what is a healthy forest would be different, you know, depending on their culture. So when you know, some of the communities that I work with, they're fisheries nations, right? So they're focused on salmon runs and other things, right? So for them, a healthy forest would be whatever promotes fishing, right? Or like, you know, the growth of fish. Whereas, you know, in the north, you know, it's moose hunting in a lot of places, right? So it would be a forest that sustains moose. So it kind of just depends, you know, on what region that you're in.
So it is still...
So it's not helpful. I know, like, you'd like to just say, you know, one that, you know, has... I think, like, overall, you would say, like, minimum undergrowth and deadfall in the forest, and then you know, nice big kind of healthy trees and young ones coming up that are also healthy.
So it is still a subjective it is still subjective to that community or the community's needs, right? It's
100%.
Okay, so it is still, it's not like it's but the ultimate goal, I suppose, is sustainability for those needs over time. So similar to the Western culture, but just a different needs, right? So it's just so there's still that subjectivity there. And
it depends what the values are in the forest, right? Like, so like with the fisheries, one thing that they like is when they burn for those fisheries nations, they like to have like high smoke
so what do you burn for fisheries nation? Like, what would they do?
Well, they would just burn their like kind of all the riverbanks and stuff. So any creeks, you know, they try and keep everything open.
So what would that do?
So, well, just to promote water, I guess, basically, and then also the temperature of the water. But then in the summer, like when it's really hot and when the fish are spawning, then they like to make fires, because basically the smoke that goes up, especially in BC, right, it kind of stays in the valleys. Then it filters the UV, right? So it keeps the streams cooler so that the fishes can spawn. Yeah, so like Frank, well, in Good Fire, our podcast, the Frank Lake episode. So Frank is, and Don Hankins too, is another episode we do there. They're both kind of fisheries guys. Their nations are, you know, dependent on the salmon run and things. So they talk in detail about that and how, you know, they burn certain type of trees for high smoke. So it really depends, and it depends in every nation like that you talk to. So one of the nations that I work in that's, you know, moose hunters, they are concerned about wood tick and how it kills or, you know, can impact moose. So they go and they burn, they basically burn meadows, any standing grass, any kind of dead grass everywhere. Because to kill wood tick and bring the wood tick down, and they depend their intervals of burning on what they see in the wood tick or in the moose, like how they're being impacted. So like, you know, if the moose don't seem to be impacted by the wood tick, then they don't burn until they start seeing signs, and then they go and burn.
No, that's cool, because it's ultimately, like I said before, it's still about sustainability and like just making sure that these values are being held on to over time. So it's interesting the parallels between like how Western culture manages the forest and how the Indigenous culture manages the forest, because there are some parallels in that we're all still managing for our own subjective needs and desires. It's just interesting to see the difference between the two, right? So a more holistic living in nature, therefore needing healthy forests for X, Y, and Z, and then the more quote unquote scientific kind of detached view where it's interesting to pick up on that kind of stuff.
Well, the hard thing too is like that I think most Indigenous people to understand like economics and like the world that we live in now, right, that we need forestry, that we, you know, that those things exist. I think that the frustration with them comes with, you know, big clear cutting or other, you know, things. Because then like for them that then eliminates like their berries, their medicinal plants, you know, to them it damages the landscape too much.
close to home because that's their
Yeah.
that's where they traditionally went to whatever, do medicinal plant picking or whatever, and that changes the dynamic for 80 years until
For
it gets
their-
back or whatever. So
yeah,
that's-
even one was talking to me about
Yeah.
like their fisheries and how like if there's too many cut blocks, like even if there is a buffer, it still to them changes the water flow, right? And how much sediment's in the water.
for
and
sure.
So
Same thing that happens
yeah.
if a big burn goes through, right? Like it would have similar but different effects. It's going to change things, right? For sure.
Yeah, so I think it's just, and I don't want people to to listen to this and think, that we're saying like, oh, stop all economic activity in the forest, because I think everybody knows, that that's kind of where we are now, but it's doing it, in a sustainable way that can, work with nations and their needs too. And I think that the difficult thing is that like there's not an easy fix, right? So almost like every territory that you're on, there's different reasons or different things that are important, right? Like up in like the Silkatine right there, juniper is really important to them, whereas down at a Shakin Indian band, it's sage. So, it just kind of depends where you are and for what you're trying to promote.
Yeah.
It depends.
Yeah.
It really depends.
No, totally. That all makes sense. And there's so getting into that, I suppose, getting into the relationship between industries that are managing the landscape in one way or another, so say the forest industry, and the relationship with Indigenous communities, and I know, and there's always been this trying to work together and come to common goals and succeed together, right? Yeah. However, there is this, you know what I mean? There's tension on both sides because the I guess the goals are different, and we're maybe not communicating properly. I'm not sure. I've never personally been a part of this process at all, but you hear it all the time from both sides that there's
frustrations.
There's frustrations and communication falls apart, and then there's emotion that takes things out of everyone's hands, and then it goes to whatever, it gets blown out of proportion, right? In this weird way. Yeah. And we're getting away from fire a little bit, but we can touch on this a little bit. And,
for sure. It's all related.
Yeah, it's all related again, right?
Yeah.
So how do you see us mending those relationships and making sure that both the Western culture and Indigenous cultures can, because like we're both here to stay, right? Like we're not going anywhere. Yeah. So we have to anticipate that this is going to be the case. Yeah. So how do we learn to live together in a very productive way for both communities? And make sure that we're not misunderstanding each other and getting frustrated with one another, because that's human nature, right? Like, you look at any political spectrum and it's chaos on both sides. But if you sit two people down that are at complete odds with one another on the politics spectrum, you sit them down at a table over a cup of coffee, and they're going to find out that their views aren't that far apart. And where they're disagreeing is it's small differences in how do we get to this economic prosperity or whatever. So I think I think there's, from my uneducated perspective when it comes to this, it seems like there's a lot of miscommunication. And how do you think we build that communication so that both parties can exist? And more importantly, I think because Western culture has taken such a advantage of Indigenous communities over, look back at residential schools and, like you were saying, all kinds of different stuff that we talked about when we first came, or colonizers first came over. How do we promote what is a damaged Indigenous culture that needs support, right, to get back on its feet?
Yeah, well, the one thing I always hear, is like people always say, oh, you need to engage with the Indigenous communities. And well, like to me, that's a nice concept. I know that lots of non-Indigenous people or companies get frustrated because, they go to these communities and try to engage and nobody turns up, or, they can't get a hold of anybody. Nobody returns their calls. And so I think for me, like the thing to remember with that is, for people to remember that for like First Nations are under the Indian Act, right? So basically all their resource and how their capital for how they're run all basically is decided in Ottawa almost, and how much money comes down to them. So most of the times, even though the communities have high capacity, for forestry or other things, it's often very underfunded because of what comes down the stream from Ottawa. Yeah. So basically there's not enough money, right? So they, might not have a forestry coordinator. They might not have a lands person you know, or the chief might be like the chief has to manage housing, healthcare, like, you know, everything. Like you can't. So I know people get frustrated, but at the same time, I think, you know, it needs to be a bit of patience and understanding there that lots of the nations are trying as much as they can. And some are great. Like there's some nations, you know, that have really gone into forestry there, you know, the community forests in BC. I think that those are a really great example of things that are working well. Or I know there's been partnerships like between different like forest industries and Indigenous nations too.
Yeah.
So I think that like the thing for me is always like the value finding, right? So you need to sit down at the table. And like I know that you were saying like about the you know, objectives are so different, but lots of times like the values are the same, right? Like most forestry people don't go into forestry because they want to, you know, kill all the trees and everything, right? They go into it because they love being in the forest, right? So they want to sustain that. Most Indigenous people love being in the forest, right? So right there you have a match of, you know, so then it almost goes to, well, then, you know, if these are our shared values, how then can we, you know, move forward together? But I think one of the problems is that there's a real lack of trust because there's been a lot of people that have taken advantage of Indigenous communities. So, you know, come in and said good things, said all the right things, and then, you know, ended up taking money and, you know, not involving the nation. And so it can take a while. I think like a helpful thing too is employing Indigenous people. So, you know, when you make or want to work in a certain nation or with them, you know, to employ people from that band and give them, you know, a sustainable, you know, career. And there's lots of Indigenous people that actually have forest tech diplomas and other things that can do that. So I think, you know, and I know it's not easy either. I don't want people to think like, oh yeah, you just sit at a table and decide your values and then everything goes away. But I think like so with UNDRIP, like the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, you know, I know that's in the Senate right now, but that's about, you know, consent and First Nations having consent over anything that happens in their territory. So I think like depending on whether that passes, but it seems, you know, like we're moving that way. So I think it's something that forest companies need to realize that it's in the future, you know.
I think they do.
So,
from my perspective, I think like they're always aware of this, but I don't think any of them ever had the toolbox to understand how to do it properly. Or you know what I mean? Or they're just like I know of a few examples where there's great communication and they're doing well and they're prospering together, right? That does exist and it's happening, but I think again, like you were saying, like the values are the same and that we want sustainability, and it's the past, the historic tensions that are there, and both are coming from two totally different perspectives that they don't recognize that it's the same values, right? And whatever, but I think like all the forest communities since like, you know what I mean? I don't know how long, but for decades now have been trying to very much engage in the Indigenous community and try and get this started. But I think there's been a lot of not success because of these challenges, right?
Yeah, well, and even like I go, you know, and I go to communities, most of them have like an Indigenous or an economic development officer or like a, you know, a corporation kind of, and it's interesting to watch like the parade of people coming in to talk to them. Because that's what I would say is that everyone almost seems to want a piece. And I think that gets frustrating for Indigenous people, you know, to kind of constantly have that. But there needs to be, you know, I think you need to recognize, you know, if you want to do this kind of work, that there has to be some kind of benefit for the community as a whole as well, whether that's, you know, monetarily or, you know, supporting like a recreational forest or, you know, something, to kind of come to that. I don't like, there's not, I think, an easy answer for, you know, like just do this one step and, you know, Indigenous people will love to work with you. But for me, I think that forestry really has an advantage over, say, like the oil and gas industry, because I think that there's many more shared values, or like, I think the worldview of an Indigenous person and a forester is much more similar. So, yeah, I think that that's kind of exciting almost. And, you know, something kind of a future. And I've seen like a bunch of nations now, you know, are opening their own little sawmills and other things. And to me, that's like exciting. So because it has to do with the housing crises we have, right? So they want to be able to, you know, harvest their own wood to build their own homes, which I mean, why we aren't doing that, I have no idea. But like, instead of shipping in
Yeah.
as wood and timber and stuff. So I think, unfortunately, there's not like a really easy answer, but I would say like the biggest thing is, to be genuine and patient and then understand that history, that the situation that you're coming into, because lots of people get like I don't want to say white savior because that sounds really bad, but it's kind of like, oh, I'm going to go to the community and help them, or like
Yeah.
And I think the problem is that there's a revolving door of these, white saviors or people that, are coming to save them. And like, even like if you go to a First Nation conference, like there's just kind of business people all over the place trying to sell the chiefs on different ideas and different things. So yeah, it's almost kind of becoming trusted in the community. And then also working long term. And that's something that, especially in government, like we don't really support, because, everyone kind of wants to climb the ladder in government. Yep. Whereas, the most trusted people are generally the ones from the community who've been in the community the longest.
Yeah.
And that's generally who like an Indigenous person would trust.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's almost like doing these relationships long term too. And I think there's some great examples out there of things that are going really well.
Yeah. Oh no, there totally is. I just want to see, because I think we've seen for so long that like a struggling Indigenous population when it comes to like defining their own culture and finding their own sustainability within their own nations and that kind of stuff, right? And having that autonomy, but also working with Western culture and I mean, we're lumping all Indigenous people together here, which is obviously not good totally, either. Yeah. But it's
but there's similar problems and issues, and I would say lots of that does come from like that funding issue. That sometimes they just don't have enough money, and then also other times, we're dealing with lots of issues that have been brought on by colonization, right? So like if you're dealing with a suicide crisis in your community, you're not really going to care about forestry, right? And so I hear people say that too, like to me sometimes about, when I talk about how we're stewards of the environment, they'll say to me like, have you ever been on a reserve and looked at like, there's garbage everywhere and, and people don't care about their houses and like, that's hardly an environmental steward. And to me, that's colonization, right? Like that's where we've gone and where we've been pushed. And I think, moving forward, it's kind of like regaining our culture back. And so that's like where to relate it to burning. We're burning in those things, because burning for us is a cultural practice, right? Yeah. And so I think by getting fire back on the landscape, by kind of making our forests healthier, then that promotes a healthier community. Yeah. So, instead of kids sitting inside, they're out on the land, and like what kid doesn't like fire, right?
Oh, totally.
So they're out with their elder, like burning. And anyways, there's neat things, like even just showing kids like how smart their ancestors were. Like the one elder that I was talking to was telling me about how drip torches actually came from First Nations people, which I didn't know. Oh, I thought that this was like, so
please explain.
So what they used to do was like, and I'm probably going to butcher it, so go talk to an elder about how they used to do this, but so they used to use certain types of bark and then pitch or sap from different types of trees. So, and it was very specific. So it had
sap has, I had Kelly Harleton on, he was talking about if you can get sap to light, like once it's been hardened into that, what do you call it?
Like a crystal almost or something?
He had a good word for it, amber. Oh, amber. Once it's become amber, so it's a hard piece of sap. If you can get that to light, and it's hard to get it to light, but once it does light, it turns into napalm.
Yeah.
Right. And so that makes total sense. Yeah.
So that's what they would use. Like, and I can't remember, they had, certain types. So I think it was like a birch branch, and then you would wrap it in some type of bark, and then to make like kind of like a, almost like a tiki torch or that kind of thing. And then same thing, they would take and harden sap, but then they would put like other types of sap around it. So it was very like, the type of procedure, you had to do certain things, and then you would light that like first layer of sap, and it would start dripping fire, right? That's and then awesome. As you walked along, you would, they like people saw that, like an Indigenous people burning that way. And then, it's like, oh, well, that's cool. Well, why don't we do it this way?
And now we just use a mixture of gas and diesel. Yeah.
Totally. So, but I think like that, to me, that's neat, because you take kids out there and you show them like, well, drip torches came from your, and
that's super cool.
And even like kids had jobs on fires, right? So, oh man, I actually heard this fantastic quote that almost made me cry the other day from this guy in Australia. And he was saying for them, burning is such a family affair. And actually, that's what I hear too from all of the people I've talked to here, is that, it wouldn't just be the men that would go out and burn. It's the entire family. And the kids, like, one thing they would do is pick up like pine cones and, light them on fire, and then from the fire, and then throw them, right? It's so, like, awesome for kids. And I know, like, there's fire managers probably listening to this saying, oh my goodness, they're going to burn down the forest.
Please do not do this if you are just a kid listening and want to start throwing flaming balls of fire. Don't do that.
Yeah, but this was obviously under the direction of elders, and, also burning at like a very low risk times, right? Like, this was not in the heat of the
controlled.
Summer. Yes. But so, it's to give the kids a job on the fire. And the one guy from Australia was saying that for his mob, that for them, it was bringing children's laughter back to the forest, because the trees hadn't heard the children laugh in a long time. And they felt that that was needed for the trees to be healthy too. And I mean, that kind of relates, like, obviously children's laughter does not, directly affect the tree, but it's more that, like, if people are out on the land stewarding it, right, then that promotes health for the health of the trees. So anyways, to me, that was such a beautiful like quote, because I think too often, we kind of remove that, or remove kind of the community.
Well, it's connecting, I think, from my perspective, from totally outside, again, the Indigenous perspective, bringing that laughter back in is kind of like it's adding to the health of the community. Right. Which is, you know what I mean? It's building a sense of community. We're doing this together. We're, you know what I mean? Like, it's that, it seems like to me, that's super beneficial.
Yeah. And that's what Saul Sanderson, he's an elder from Saskatchewan. And he was telling me that, like, one of the problems with, or issues we're having with our nations right now is, from that, the legacy of residential schools, where we felt like our knowledge didn't matter, and it almost made us, like, hate ourselves and hate everyone around us. And so I was telling you that story about if you want to know more about that, there's, like, the Truth and Reconciliation. If you go on YouTube, there's testimony of survivors. And I was listening to one, and the woman was talking about how the worst thing about residential schools was she went from, like, a kid at 3 who loved her mom and dad and thought the world of them, to coming home at 12 and hating her parents, like, thinking that they were the world's worst things, like they didn't know anything, how dare they talk. And then she anyways got into problems with drugs and alcohol because she had no parents or anything, and
no
didn't
support system anymore.
Didn't approve, didn't believe her parents' opinion anyways, because they were worthless human beings, or not even humans, right? Savages. And so he was saying to me that, like, lots of those issues and things, it's like the suicide problems, the alcohol and drug addiction, like, it's like if you think of a tree, so those are kind of all the branches of the problems, but there's a real core, or like the root of the problem. So lots of times we're addressing all these branch symptoms instead of the actual real problem, which is like a loss of culture and knowledge. So to me, burning comes into that. And I know people think, like, oh, it's just like burning a forest, like, or, burning the understory. It's not a big thing, but, it's getting people out on land. It's telling them how much their ancestors knew about forests, how well they managed the forest, how they were able to live in, like, very difficult conditions through that knowledge base that they had. And then, having them practice it and try and bring it back and be valued, like, especially when, like, fire managers or, firefighters come and watch these burns, and they're like, wow, that's cool. Like, I didn't know you could, do that, or use a rake that way, or this and that. And then, like, they see then that these white people are valuing their family, right? And so to them too, that's just like that kind of sense of pride. And so I think, to me, that's, like, not only in burning, but in lots, like, language and other things, right? That we can bring back, like, that, the importance of culture to our communities.
It's a tough one to try and get across to people. Myself, I don't understand it, right? Like, I try to sympathize with it and try to get what you're saying. And, like, I feel like I'm starting to get it over the course of, like, whatever 8 episodes,
10 podcasts
we did together.
Come on, Matt.
Talking with different people, but I still don't know firsthand, right? Is what I'm saying. And to try to convince people who are outside of this culture the importance of this, right? To help healthy Indigenous communities become healthy and prosperous again in a way that they can, you know what I mean, support themselves in a way they haven't been able to in the last 100 years. Because of X, Y, and Z. All you know what I mean? All the historical trauma and all that kind of stuff, right? But it was like you were saying, right? Like, it seems like up until this point, a lot of what we've been doing has been treating the symptom, not the problem. Like, I mean, you talk to anybody that has anything to do with helping addicts, right? The problem isn't that they're addicted to drugs. That's a symptom. The problem is they have a severe amount of trauma that they're trying to hide with drugs. Same with alcoholics, right? Like alcoholism isn't the problem. It's a symptom of the problem. You have to fix the trauma and fix the brain before, you know what I mean? So
before you can even address that.
Yeah, before you can even address that part of it, because otherwise they're just trying to cope, right? It's a coping mechanism. And I think we've kind of seen, and I don't know if that's an offensive comparison, but what I'm saying is like it seems like the Indigenous community has been so traumatized in a massive way, and to just expect them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps is absurd. It's crazy talk, right?
Yeah,
like it's
well,
just, it's
my grandmother went to residential school up in Laklabish area, and she, I mean, wouldn't even talk about it, what happened to her there, but she was so traumatized, I guess, by what happened, is that she moved her family so that they wouldn't have to go to, her children wouldn't have to go to that school, and so she could be there. So she, you know, took her kids to they moved up to Fort McMurray, so she took her kids to the school up there every single day, you know, to make sure that they were getting care. But then she became an alcoholic and actually died very young, like falling down a flight of stairs, drunk. And then, you know, my family is full of alcoholics and drug addicts. And I think that it's just from that, because, you know, then she wasn't there to properly, you know, raise her kids, which then, you know,
perpetuates.
Led to other people. And so I think like a good example too is like of kind of like, I guess, well-meaning people, like forestry people, but you know, that where it doesn't come across so great is like for bringing back cultural burning, right? So lots of nations now want to bring back burning. And so on our, like the reserves, we're technically allowed to burn, right? Because that's the band. Well, it's federal jurisdiction, but, you know, the band kind of has a bit of control over it. So, you know, that you don't need provincial permission to do that. So, you know, lots of fire management agencies say, you know, oh, we're so supportive of Indigenous people and we want to help them, you know, support their practices, you know, until we say, you know, we want to burn something. So, you know, what I've seen even, you know, in BC is where I'm doing a lot of work right now, because the nations there are so passionate about burning, but you know, they're going into these meetings and it's, you know, like a really complicated process to get prescribed burning on the ground. And it's very Western based. You know, you have to know like fuel types that are out there.
That's the culture we live in now, right? So of course there's going to be that kind of bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's like a crazy 12-step process. And most of the communities look at that and just say, you know, well, screw this. We're burning ourselves, you know. And then even when they want to burn, like I've heard of lots, you know, where somebody sees smoke and then, you know, calls the emergency number, and then, you know, a helicopter will just come and put out their little fire that they're burning, right? Without, you know, coming and dropping down and maybe talking to the people or seeing what's going on. So there's a bit of a disconnect, and I can see it from both sides, right? Because especially in BC, like the fires has been so crazy that I think, you know, the BC fire management or wildfire service there, you know, obviously doesn't want out of control fires.
Yes.
But the nations there want to burn. And so what I'm seeing right now is because they're just like smashing heads, basically. You know, like they're supportive until we want to burn. And because of that smashing of heads is that now the nations are saying like, well, screw you. This is our territory. We're doing what we want. Yeah. You know, and then like it becomes like this real conflict situation. Yeah. So I'm hoping, you know, that, you know, working together, we can do that. And we're trying to work with like the agency and, you know, maybe even introduce some sort of like cultural burn protocol or procedure, you know, that's more Indigenous based. That same thing, like you're kind of getting permission, you know, you're notifying the correct authorities, but it's not as crazy as this like existing process.
Well, I think that's, and we've just, again, this is another thing we've discussed a bit on the other episodes we did, that, the Good Fire podcast, but talking about that's another big barrier to Indigenous burning or cultural burning, however you want to call it, is the Western barriers on that, because like you're right, we don't want out of control fires.
Yes.
So the Western government, like we want to make sure that like any fire that is started is not going to become a problem for anything outside of the reserve or whatever, right? Yeah. And but also at the same time recognizing that, like you were saying, Indigenous people have been working with fire for thousands of years and understand the relationship. So how do you make sure that government feels comfortable with this going on, but also ensuring that because it's entirely possible also, like this is something that somebody who's playing devil's advocate would say, right?
Yeah.
Is just saying that like, well, how do we ensure that they know what they're doing? Because it could be somebody who, just because they're Indigenous doesn't mean they know what's going on, right? They have to have that knowledge passed down and collected somehow.
Yeah.
And
I've heard that all the time. Like,
Right.
oh, if we allow this, the Indians are going to be lighting fires everywhere.
and
Like,
yeah, exactly, right? And then
that kind of fear. Yeah.
right. So there's that fear of, will they take advantage of this and just do it for fun or whatever? And that exists.
Yeah.
So we have to address that fear. So how do we, there's going to have to be a collaboration somehow to be like, okay, we acknowledge that like these 4 people somehow, unfortunately, that's the way it's going to have to, I think it's probably going to have to go, that these 4 people in this band have the knowledge and they have to be like, I don't know. And this is super westernized of me to think, right?
Yeah.
Like these people have the knowledge and the understanding of how to do this. So if they're in charge, we're not going to worry about it. And I feel like, but I also feel like Indigenous communities having to talk to the overlord, the government, about what they're doing on their own land is exactly the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish here.
Yeah, and so that's like, so like there's fire boss training, right? Like that you go, or no, burn boss training.
Yeah.
So there's like different levels of that you can go through. Same thing, it's very Western. Like I know that now, like there's Bob Gray and other guys who train on that, who are starting to incorporate a bit of Indigenous knowledge, or the importance of Indigenous knowledge in burning. But same, it's very like kind of Western, this is how we light a prescribed fire. And
that's all we know. That's the only culture I know, right?
Totally,
so it's where my perspective is going to come from.
Yeah. So then we thought like, okay, well, like, we were doing brainstorming with some of the fire keepers, and we're like, well, they do a certification course to get that. So maybe what we need to do then is have a cultural burning certification course, right? So that, people would go through, and then once they get that, then, they can go and light fires or whatever. But then we had a lot of fire keepers that were saying like, no, that is basically just us trying to fit into a Western system.
Right.
And they were saying like, the one guy actually at the fire keepers conference I just went to, the government people were talking, and he stood up and he just said, I find this really difficult, because they were talking about, like all the procedures you need to go through to get approval.
And they're trying to do what they think is right. They're
yes.
trying to be
And
inclusive.
very nice people too,
Right.
and being there, and, they're trying, and they were saying like, we'll work with you to get fire on the ground. We'll do anything. But he stood up and he just said, for me, this is my family's, like my nation's inherent right to steward the land. This is my responsibility. This is why I was put on this earth. Yeah. So for me then to have to go and ask you for permission to do what is my responsibility and my right, that doesn't make any sense. And then he was saying like, 100 years ago, you guys were telling us we couldn't burn because we were destroying the forest. And now you're saying to us, oh, only we can burn because, you guys, because now the forest is destroyed. And he's like, you're the ones, whose practices, because you wouldn't listen to us, have led to this. If you would have listened to my ancestors, then we wouldn't be in this predicament we're in now. So like, let us kind of take it over. So I think it's one of those like, I don't really like that term, like wicked issue, where it's like super complex, but it is kind of like that in a way, right? Because you're worried the forest isn't healthy right now. I don't personally want to say to somebody like, yeah, go out and burn, and then have, a massive ground fire start. But I think the thing is with Indigenous fire practice is that it's, you're burning at very specific times. So, it's like early spring before the snow is left in Canada. It's late fall, just like the day or two before the first snowfall, right? You're not burning like obviously in the summer. So like I would think that, obviously still should be criminalized to some extent, that you need to find people or whatever that are just going, because that is very high risk. Yeah. And so like what our, like elders and ancestors say from like the different nations that I've talked to is that, our burning that we do is so low risk. That's why we don't need protective equipment. That's why we don't need a burn plan, because if we're doing it right, there's literally very low or zero risk. Well, I think they would say zero risk to what they're doing, to starting an out of control fire or somebody getting hurt. So it's hard though, like, because I can see,
prescribed burns for the most part, if they're not to fight a current existing wildfire, prescribed burns are generally done at the same time that you're talking about, right? Late fall, early spring, when the winds are down, humidity's high, and they can keep it under control.
Yeah,
That being
but they're
said-
usually trying to start like a bigger fire, right?
Well, depending.
Yeah,
so,
that's, yeah.
Like a lot of times it's just they're just doing grass stuff to reduce fire hazard around a town or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Or like in the national parks, they'll be they want to light up a hill of pine because it's totally
Dead or
beetle
something.
killed,
Yeah, yeah.
and they want to light it up so that it doesn't turn into an uncontrolled fire and tear it up. But yeah, there's lots of reasons for it.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm saying is, like, because it is fire, it can get out of hand, right? And I guess like you were saying, so because I don't know the answer to this, so I'm trying to. How do you propose that we get cultural burning back on the landscape in a way that satisfies like the Indigenous need, as well as doesn't freak out us spazzes on the western side, right?
You worry warts. Yeah.
So like, how do you, because the reality is we're all people, mistakes happen, and like shit can happen, right? Inevitably with fire, if you do red enough fires, one of them's going to get away.
Well, and there's elders that almost every elder tells me, about a story about a fire that got away.
Yeah, and it happens.
Yeah.
So how do we create this system of confidence between two communities that are very different, but have similar goals? How do I don't know. I don't even know how to ask this question, but you see, understand what I'm saying, right?
No, totally. So it's hard, and I think like the thing is I don't have an answer either, which isn't helpful at all. But like I think so. That's one thing with the Good Fire podcast, to plug us again, is that we kind of go through by talking to people in different jurisdictions and how they handle the problem. So like in Australia, we talked to like Oliver Costello, who's from like the Fire Sticks Alliance, and he talks there about how they've removed like prescribed burning or burning. Now they call it a cultural practice that they're doing. So then they don't fall under burning regulations. So remember he talks about that in detail and how they kind of, use that. And then Trent and Tim, like they have the Federation of Traditional Landowners in the state of Victoria in Australia. And they're actually writing up like a protocol on cultural burning. And so, and like in Canada, actually, I think, so one thing we're doing is we're doing an Indigenous Fire Smart booklet that'll be coming out in the fall of 2019. And so in that, we're looking at Indigenous knowledge about fire, but then at the same time, how can we be fire smart, and not, do the best for our communities and for the forest. And it's actually being written by all Indigenous authors by across the country.
That's
and
awesome.
It has Indigenous peer reviewers, and we'll have Indigenous art in it. So I think like that can maybe start. And then we also are starting an Indigenous fire management working group that also will be at a national level.
Okay.
So looking at these things and, how can we start moving? Like I was talking to one of the chiefs from out in BC. Chief Ron Ignace. And he was telling me that after the fires happened, they were really concerned about mushroom pickers coming onto their territory. So he said that what he did was he went through like all the laws and regulations in Canada, and he found out that there's no law that actually controls the understory. So what he did was they declared that the understory is their territory for their nation. Right. And so that way they could control the mushroom picking. So they basically, you might have seen like those signs that they put up that said like, you can't come on into our territory unless you have permission. And he was saying that they hauled out like, they put up porta potties and stuff, and hauled out like thousands of gallons of human waste that would have, been strewn across their territory. And so I was talking to him because I'm like, I wonder how that would work for fire.
Wait, can you explain? I don't understand the waste thing. The outhouses. What was that about?
Well, because all the mushroom pickers come, like thousands of them, to get the morel mushrooms, right? And they camp on the territory and then pick all summer, right? And make like a lot of money off of the mushrooms that grow after. Yeah. So before, like they would just random camp, right? And like kind of,
literally just shit
go
in the bush.
everywhere.
Okay.
And so they were concerned because of how many people were coming in.
I see.
And lots of times too, they'll abandon their campsites and other things. So they put like dumpsters up, they put porta potties, and they kind of tried to control it. And the province actually got behind them and helped support them on that. And so I was saying to him, like, how would that work for fire? Because, what we want to burn is the understory. And his response to me was, let's do it. Because he's like, he's the kind of guy. And I think that this is where a lot of chiefs are going, is like, this is our inherent right to do. And, you can try, like, bring a lawsuit, charge me, and then we'll go to court. And
it's an interesting protest for sure.
And we'll see who wins. Because his feeling is that, you know, through Indigenous inherent rights and UNDRIP and other things that, you know, that basically he won't, you know, that you can't do anything about it, basically, like, you know, at a legal level.
Right.
Because it's their territory, they feel. So, but
as
like,
long as it doesn't get out of hand and then and gets out of the reserve, and then all of a sudden they have a lawsuit on the reserve.
But
for
they argue
whatever. Right?
But there's a difference for us between the reserve, which to us is where we were forced by government, right? And then our territory, right? So
no,
like,
of course, I'm not questioning. I'm just saying. I'm just saying, like,
Mm-hmm.
from a legal Western perspective, they could have grounds, and like I would worry that you don't want to put that community in a risky situation just for a protest or what. But I don't know. Again, I shouldn't.
But
even
again,
be.
but I know what you mean. But to me, like, the burn should be like incredibly low risk, right? Like, not to get out of hands like that. Yeah,
for sure.
But then at the same time, like, so for him, it wouldn't be like only burning on his reserve, right? It would be burning anywhere in their nation's territory.
Right.
So, and I think
traditional territory from like before colonialization. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of where the hard thing comes in, because forestry people and government folks see that as crown land, right? But most Indigenous people don't recognize crown land. They think that that's their, you know, their territory.
Yeah.
And so that's like where all the legal stuff comes in.
That's what I'm
right?
saying.
So
I think that's what I'm getting at. How do we navigate that issue, right? Because it's a real issue that exists, right? Like, we all feel like, oh, it's crown land, it's public land, like it's shared by all of us. But then Indigenous communities also feel like, well, like, we've been doing this successfully for thousands of years, and we have, like, we should have rights to continue to practice our culture the way we always have. Yeah. And to not be restricted by, you know, Western civilization. So, like, how do we, it's a crazy.
It's hard, yeah.
Because, like, you want to, because now that there are both cultures living on this landscape, you do want to protect both sides of it. Like, you don't want to allow, I don't know, like, you have to protect all the values at the same time, right?
Well, and I think that's why it's really important to start to work together and to, like, kind of do this two-eyed seeing, and because, like you said, both cultures are here now, and it's going to be and so for me, for Indigenous people, like, and myself, to get fire back on the landscape, a much easier approach is, you know, to work with partners like wildfire management agencies, forestry companies, to get fire back on the ground, right? Rather than, like, you know, go into some big legal fight with everybody.
Because,
so
like, it might make a statement, but it also is just going to embolden both sides.
Yeah. Well, and everyone just gets their backs up at each other then, right? Like,
so we need to get to a round table where everyone's talking, communicating, and working this out over time, right? And just discussion constantly. And it's, but it's a difficult, because you don't want to step on the rights and, like, of Indigenous people, but you also, there's whatever 30 million non-Indigenous people living in this country now. So it's like, how do we?
Well, I would say the one thing, it's a lot easier in the north because
like, there's nobody up there.
It's mostly Indigenous people. So like, up there, you know, it's not a big deal. But like, if you're, say, Penticton Indian Band, right? Like, their territory is basically where a lot of Albertans and stuff go, and people have $1 million summer homes, and they don't necessarily want to be smoked out or put what they would say is at risk, right? So I think for me, like, that's what I'm hoping with this Indigenous Fire Working Group, because we've never had something like this in Canada. And I know too, like, you know, we wouldn't be speaking for all nations or anything like that, but to me, it's to bring Indigenous fire people from across Canada to start looking at maybe potential solutions for things, and how we can work together and work with agencies and stuff, you know, to do this. Because for me, like, for agency, for fire management agencies, like, Indigenous people are such an amazing partner to get fire back on the ground. Because I know in some areas it's like, oh, well, you know, the population is concerned about smoke. But if you can say, like, you know, we are supporting such and such nation in their, like, cultural practice of burning, you know, it gets a lot of public support a lot quicker. So I think, to me, that's something that we need to take advantage of as fire management people, you know, it's an easy win in that way.
No, for sure. It's just, it's amazingly how complicated, or it's amazing how complicated the situation is to try and navigate this. But I think, the only way forward is to come together and have these discussions. Right?
Well, and
it seems like a cop out to say that, because it's just like we need to discuss it. But like, unfortunately, that's the truth.
Well, and on the Good Fire podcast, I think, like, that's what's interesting, is because with the range of people that we talk to on there, like, you go from somebody who thinks, like it's their right to burn and they're not working with any agency, and then to like other people who, are employed like me kind of by an agency.
Yeah.
Like Frank Lake, he works for U.S. Forest Service, and he's used his, work within this kind of Western government structure to bring more fire back to his territory. So yeah, it's really interesting to see kind of all the different perspectives.
Yeah. And it seems like we're heading, like we have to head towards some kind of true collaboration in, you know what I mean? Like it's not going to be, unfortunately, like it's not going to be pure like traditional Indigenous culture, because now Western society is integrated into that.
Yeah.
And it's hopefully not going to be pure Western culture. Hopefully we can move towards some integration where both can exist in some kind of stasis, right? And help each other and coexist and become stronger because of that, instead of being at odds, right? But it's a long ways to go. I mean, we have hundreds of years of trauma and, you know what I mean? And all kinds of, I don't even know the word, but
yeah. Well, and even like you think like, oh, fire management in the north, like who cares, right? Like if Indigenous people want to burn up there or do whatever. But to me, we need to support that, because those are often the fires that, smoke out Edmonton and Calgary, like, all summer, because like, when a big boreal fire gets rolling, it produces a lot of smoke. So, I think that, there's ways, easy wins in Canada. And I think that we need to start doing stuff, because with climate change, like, obviously our wildfire risk is only going to get worse. So yeah, if we can, start now at this kind of two-eyed seeing approach, I think it'll be really, beneficial, I hope, for everyone and for the forest too.
Yeah, this is a good conversation. I enjoyed this.
Okay, sorry, what time am I talking to? When you were going like this, I thought you were saying like wrap it up.
Oh, like I was tapping my wrist. Yeah, no.
I was like, already, wow.
No.
Okay.
But yeah, it's 12:30 now, so you probably got to get out of here. But
yeah, well, do you have any final?
I don't. Those are
Questions?
the things that I wanted to get to. I think I want to point people towards the Good Fire podcast, which is going to come out. Well, this podcast is coming out in June. Okay. So hoping the Good Fire will come out sometime after that. Yeah. Hopefully quickly. Yeah. I know I'm kind of going to be distracted, and you will be too.
Yeah. Well, I know it's kind of that happy medium for like,
Yeah.
But once baby comes in, you get into a routine and back at work, it'll be
Yeah, it'll be okay. So okay. I think that, unless you have something else you want to kind of final words of wisdom.
Yeah, no, I think it's just for me. Like, I don't want when people listen to it, because I know most people listen from like a Eurocentric or a Western perspective. Yeah. So, I don't want them to think, that it's just, some kind of hippie stuff about, like the trees and the animals are talking to you.
Yeah, no, for sure.
It's more like, to me, it's more like there's scientific evidence for some of those things as well.
Well, that's the thing. We're coming to a realization. Like the scientific method is also coming to these realizations that the Indigenous community is known for ever. Yeah. Right? Like it just took us a while to figure that out, right? Yeah. Well, like you were saying about the wolves eating berries and shrubs or whatever it was, right? Like,
berries and fishing. That just came out as a new discovery, that wolves do that. And I was like, anybody in the north knows that.
And trappers, like they're all going to know that. But for some reason the Western science has only just figured it out.
Well, I think it was U.S. researchers that found that out. It was like
Thanks guys.
But so like another big story was like the like the birds of prey in Australia. You probably saw that one about how they were dropping basically they were spreading fire, the birds there, the falcons and stuff. So they
were picking up burning branches
from a fire,
carrying them somewhere and dropping them to start a fire, and they were preying on the rodents that were running from the fire
and the insects that kind of flee the fire.
I know, it's so crazy.
But the crazy thing was that was an I can't remember what's the word for a bird guy, ornithologist, who like a Western science guy who went up there and observed 3 birds doing it. So like wrote a paper and got tons of press. Well, there are ceremonies from the Northern Territory that are hundreds of thousands of years old that incorporate birds using fire in them. So like Indigenous people from that area have observed that and known that, forever. And so I think it's just kind of recognizing, that Indigenous people do know about fire too. There's not only kind of one way to see fire.
Well, and I think we said this in another episode too, was that the scientific method in its truest form, I mean, Indigenous cultures have basically lived through that, through trial and error, right? And figuring out trial and error over thousands of years, figuring out what's right. So it is, in a sense, the same thing as the Western scientific method, only in a less formal way, right? It happened over generations instead of whatever with a published paper, right? So it's
but it's the same technique though as science, where it's like, you know, you're testing something, right? So obviously, like, I don't think that my ancestors just like, you know, woke up one day and like, you know, everything. Although there's been some, you know, some that were gifted certain things, but, you know, knew immediately like, well, this is exactly how we need to fire a meadow to, you know, promote moose coming back to it. I think that it was more like, you know, maybe seeing a wildfire, like, and then, you know, seeing after what happened and then thinking like, you know, oh, we should try that over here. And then, I mean, maybe the first few burns got away, or the, you know, or it was burned too hot. And I think that just happened over. And then obviously you hone your practice, right? And you pass on that knowledge. And so instead of writing textbooks about it, we like told stories about it, which is the big difference.
Yeah, it was just a different culture.
Yeah, well, Trent Nelson from Australia, he is one of the best quotes I've ever heard. And he's like always says about fire, I don't need a textbook. I have my grandmother. And like, I love that quote from him, because like his grandma's a fire. Well, they don't call them firekeepers, but you know, in Australia. So yeah, he knew about fire from her. Yeah.
No, it's awesome. I hope that we see more collaboration, and I think, and it seems like from like what you've told me, like since we've known each other the last few months, and from outside people talking, it sounds like as a culture we are starting to recognize the traumas that have happened and starting to recognize the injustices that have happened, and we are starting to work towards that promotion of these kind of activities, right? Because I think it's important as a society that we recognize and make amends, right, in those situations, and make sure that environmental integrity and stewardship is held at the forefront of all of that, right? So,
what I would say, like, to, you know, forestry folks that are listening into this is like, you know, and have had frustrations trying to work with Indigenous nations, or, you know, other things, I think, or, you know, seeing news stories about us and things, is like just to remember, you know, what our nations have gone through, and to, you know, have patience with us as we kind of move our way forward. Like, it's going to take a long time for us to heal from some of the trauma that our families have gone through. But it's just, you know, I think like with having support and allowing us to kind of being supportive of us bringing cultural practice back, you know, and having advocates and allies in the non-Indigenous community is really helpful. So yeah, I would just say, like, I know people get frustrated when they're trying to work with a nation and, you know, they have really good intent, but it's just not working out. But just to remember, you know, that like lots of problems and financial issues and stuff are a result of like the Indian Act and colonization. So yeah, to just kind of have a little bit of patience with our communities.
Well, and it's like that myth you were telling me at the beginning, that people always think that like the Indigenous communities are getting all kinds of tax money from, you know, from Canadian taxpayers all the time, and they shouldn't be complaining or whatever, right? You hear that all the time. And the truth was, and like basically since colonization, when Indigenous people, like, you know, the treaties were signed or resources have been taken for our land or land has been sold, the federal government put it into trust. So there's these big trusts that the federal government holds, and it's actually the amounts are confidential, but the last I heard was like $2.5 trillion. So basically the entire apparatus in the federal government, so, you know, like Indian Affairs, what are they called now? Indigenous Services Canada and the Department of, I don't know, CERNAC or something, the Crown Indigenous Relations, something like that. So all of those are funded from that trust. So they're not actually funded from taxpayer money. And so any money that comes down to communities through that is also coming from this trust, which is our money that's being kind of, so it'd be kind of like you or your family, you know, somebody saying like, you know, well, we know more than you. We're going to take your salary and store it here. And then we'll give you, you know, someone over you and pay them out of that money to, you know, make sure that you're making the right choices in your life. So I think that that's, you know, something maybe that people don't know. I never thought about that. Yeah, that is messed up.
Yeah. Well, and so what some nations are trying, so like Treaty 6, you know, they believe that when they sign treaty, they sign that relationship directly with the Crown, not with the government of Canada. So what they're saying is that they want the money for their nations to come directly from that trust to their communities. And then their nations will instead do the management.
Because you're saying it's being filtered through the government right now.
Through the federal government.
And they're taking administration probably and stuff.
Well, basically all the salaries of anybody employed in those departments, right?
Comes from there.
Yeah, so it's like, so when you think of that, so lots of them are saying like, you know, instead of having the First Nations Inuit Health Branch, and all those people overseeing, our health. Instead, we'll have our own community health department with that money. But, it's, so that all comes from like the residue from the Indian Act and things.
Wow.
So,
I know nothing about any of that. And it's like, it blows my mind to hear that kind of stuff. That's crazy.
Well, it's so complex, and that's like what I get. And so lots of times too, people will say, that there's no like title, like lots of Indigenous people don't believe in like title or whatever for individuals, but there's actually like it's like such a complicated system of Indigenous land rights. And, and we think of land as more communal than like kind of the individual European nation. So like to us, like there still is land ownership, right? But it's by a nation. It's maybe not by like the individual person who, owns a quarter section.
Right.
So, but it's like, so those things, it's just hard to figure them out. And even like me, like some of these things, I spend my life doing this and I'm still like, whoa, didn't know that. Like didn't know.
Oh, it's bananas.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we decided that it's very complicated and we should continue to talk about it, and that's great.
And listen to Good Fire.
And
That's
Fire. Yeah, okay, awesome. Well, thanks a lot for coming on. This is perfect.
Yeah, thanks,
I think we
Matt.
wrapped it up in a very confusing and hopefully
non-helpful
very
way.
educational way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I really hope you liked that one. I know I really enjoyed it. Amy's awesome. She continues to teach me a lot as every single time we sit down and do one of these Good Fire podcast episodes. I learn so much more, and it's such a well of knowledge. And I really hope that through conversations like this, we can start to see more cultural burning on the landscape, right? So, remember to in September, I'll remind you, Good Fire podcast. September 2019 will be coming out, and all kinds of great stuff on there. So you guys are really going to like it. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps me out. I really, really hope you guys do that. Appreciate it. And shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I will get back to you. Unless something happens where I get flooded with a million emails, I will get back to you. And it hasn't happened yet. So, all right. Take it easy, guys. Thanks for listening.